15 years ago, the greatest pro wrestler who ever lived died in the ring. His name was Mitsuharu Misawa. He knew his life could come to an end in a wrestling match and left a secret letter for the wrestler who might accidentally one day deliver the final move of his career. But this isn't a story about death. It's the story of a man who reset the bar for what great pro wrestling looks like in the ring, and outside of it, reshaped the very landscape of the business. A man who could bring entire arenas to tears without saying a single word, who led quite possibly the greatest wrestling event sellout streak of all time, who gave us some of the greatest matches of all time. An innovator, a leader, an icon, but also a man who felt he could never rest. While the outcomes of the matches he wrestled in were predetermined, there was nothing fake about the hell he put his body through. This is the story of a man who gave everything he had to pro wrestling, including his life. It's the story of Mitsuharu Misawa. If you are interested in more Japanese pro wrestling documentaries like this one, consider subscribing to the channel or even supporting it on Patreon. Now, let's start this story at the beginning. Birth name Mitsuharu Kotake, he was born the son of a coal miner in Hokkaido, northern Japan. But the mining industry was in decline, and his family moved to Saitama, a province in the Kanto region where Misawa would grow up. His father was a violent man and physically abusive to his mother. When the two divorced, the young Mitsuharu took his mother's name, Misawa. Growing up, a young Mitsuharu was a track and field star, a one-time aspiring boxer, and a good amateur wrestler in high school. But by the 8th grade, he'd already made up his mind about his future. He was going to be a pro wrestler. In fact, he wanted to run off and be a wrestler right out of junior high, but his mother and an influential teacher convinced him to at least finish high school. And that's how he ended up at Ashikaga Institute of Technology's renowned amateur wrestling program, along with a certain underclassman the year below him named Toshiaki Kawada. As some of you already no doubt know, Kawada would become a pivotal figure in Misawa's career, and their two destinies seemed to be intertwined from this moment on. But for now, Mitsuharu Misawa was just a high school kid with dreams of pro wrestling glory. There's even a story about him wanting to drop out in his second year and run off to join All Japan Pro Wrestling. But a meeting with Jumbo Tsuruta, All Japan's top star in the 1980s, convinced him to finish his schooling before putting on tights. And he would, before long, make his dream a reality. In March of 1981, Misawa entered the All Japan Pro Wrestling Dojo. And if you're not intimately familiar with Japanese pro wrestling, you might not know what that means. Modeled after the dojo system in the sport of sumo, pro wrestling dojos are intense training houses where young, hopeful wrestlers learn the fundamental skill sets they need before being allowed to debut in the ring. It seems Misawa became something of a pet project for All Japan founder Shohei Giant Baba, doing special duty like helping him take off his boots after matches and even washing his back, in addition to the endless training regimes of the dojo. Dojo training has a reputation for being particularly punishing to young trainees. Thankfully for Misawa, he completed his time pretty quickly and debuted in August of 1981 against future New Japan Junior Heavyweight star Shiro Koshinaka. And his first few months as a wrestler were pretty typical for a rookie. He lost a lot. It took him 18 matches to get his first win, and that was in a tag bout. It took him 21 matches before he got his first singles win. And things would continue like this for the next few years, with the young up-and-comer learning his lessons, eating pinfalls, and more often than not, ending his matches by staring up at the lights. His big break came in 1983, when he made the finals of an event called the Luthez Cup. It was a round-robin tournament where the winner would be sent on a foreign excursion to hone their craft in a wrestling promotion overseas. And it would be Misawa's television debut for the company. He was booked to lose in the finals against Shiro Koshinaka, the man he debuted against originally. But All Japan founder Giant Baba knew there was something special about this kid from Saitama, so he sent them both. Thus would begin Misawa's short but pivotal odyssey in Mexico. You could think of foreign excursions like this as the final part of a wrestler's training. They've survived the dojo, they've racked up their rookie losses, and now they need to go learn new skills in front of a strange crowd in an unfamiliar place. Misawa's unfamiliar place was EMLL in March of 1984, the historic lucha libre promotion that today is known as CMLL. Wrestling under the name Kamikaze Misawa, he teamed with Koshinaka and learned to work the EMLL style under the guidance of a luchador named La Fiera. He even had his first major singles title match in Mexico. And the young Misawa absorbed all he could, evolving his in-ring style and incorporating the skills taught to him by La Fiera. But a fateful phone call from Giant Baba would cut short his time in Mexico. Just 6 months after he left, Misawa would be back wrestling in Japan, this time under very different circumstances. Because in 1984, All Japan acquired the likeness rights to Tiger Mask, a popular manga and anime character. The manga was about a pro wrestler who wore, you probably guessed it, a tiger mask and battled various evil wrestlers with outlandish powers and gimmicks. AJPW's rival company, New Japan Pro Wrestling, originally held the rights to the character, and they were the first to bring him to life, casting a wrestler named Satoru Sayama in the role. But with the license to use the character passing from Antonio Inoki's company to Baba's, he now needed a tiger mask. And there just so happened to be a young talent he'd taken a liking to, who was training in Mexico and learning the kind of aerial maneuvers that Tiger Mask was known for. It must have seemed to Baba like the perfect fit. And so, Mitsuharu Misawa debuted as the second Tiger Mask opposite his teacher La Fiera in front of 13,000 people in August of 1984. Under the Tiger Mask character, Misawa would team with Giant Baba. He'd work with the original Tiger Mask rivals like the Dynamite Kid and put on some of the better junior heavyweight matches of that era with Kuniaki Kobayashi. Kobayashi was a transplant from New Japan and himself completed an excursion to Mexico just a few years prior. The two men were the perfect dance partners. In 1985, Tiger Mask was on the chase for Kobayashi's NWA International Junior Heavyweight Championship. They clashed in June of that year for an unforgettable display of junior heavyweight style wrestling. But before that match, Misawa had actually badly injured his knee, although you wouldn't know it from the tape. After getting surgery on the knee, they faced off once again in August, and this time Misawa would be the one with his hand raised in the end. He'd won his first major singles title, and done so with the first in a very long line of legendary finishers, the Tiger Suplex 85. A suplex variant seamlessly transitioned into a pin. And Misawa never actually lost that belt. He vacated it to move up to the heavyweight ranks. All Japan was never a place where smaller wrestlers really thrived, and a move to the next level was inevitable. As a heavyweight, Tiger Mask would team up with the star of AJPW in the 80s, Jumbo Tsuruta, and together they'd win the PWF World Tag Team Championship. As far as singles matches goes, he had matches with a list of American legends, like Ric Flair, Ricky Steamboat, and Ted DiBiase, to name a few. On a more personal note, in 1988, Misawa married his wife Mayumi. They would eventually have 2 children together, a daughter and a son. He was, by all accounts, a very private man, and there isn't a great deal of information out there about his family life. In fact, it's been said that some of the wrestlers he worked with later on didn't even know he had kids. After an unsuccessful challenge for the NWA heavyweight title against Ricky Steamboat in 1989, another knee surgery put Misawa on the shelf for 9 months. He was only 27 years old, but already the damage was starting to mount. When he came back next year, he'd walk right into the Tokyo Dome. In February of 1990, AJPW swooped in to join rival company New Japan Pro Wrestling in a supercard show that saw Tiger Mask and Genichiro Tenryu team up against Riki Choshu and George Takano. And the pairing of these two men, in retrospect, was almost poetic. One would represent the future prosperity of the company. The other was very much an icon of the present and would be gone in just a few months. In April, Misawa would win the All-Asia Tag Team Championship with Kenta Kobashi, one of the very last significant things he did as Tiger Mask. It can be a little tempting to gloss over Misawa's time under the mask because of what comes after, but there's some great stuff here. From his thrilling matches with Kobayashi to his evolution from a junior heavyweight high flyer to more of a heavyweight with luchador tendencies, it's worth looking back at the early days of one of the greatest of all time. The irony is, Misawa did not like wrestling as Tiger Mask. He hated working while wearing the actual mask itself. He was perpetually stuck in the shadow of Satoru Sayama, and the injuries associated with the high-flying style were mounting. In short, he wanted out. And in May of 1990, he'd get his wish. That year, change was in the air. Not just for all Japan, and not just for pro wrestling. The reigning emperor of Japan had died the year prior, thus ending the country's long-standing Showa era. In AJPW, the very philosophy behind their product was evolving. The days of frustrating non-finishes and disqualification endings that plagued the company in the 1980s were becoming a thing of the past. Now, in the 1990s, a booking style called King's Road or Royal Road was beginning to emerge. But the winds of change brought turmoil to the company as well. One of AJPW's top stars, Genichiro Tenryu, shocked audiences when he abruptly picked up and left the promotion to headline his own, Super World of Sports, or SWS, and he brought half a dozen other wrestlers with him. That happened in April of 1990, and it left a void in the main event scene, and so in May, the mask finally came off. It happened during a tag match that paired Misawa with his old wrestling club Kohai Toshiaki Kawada against Samson Fuyuki and Yoshiaki Yatsu. The end of Tiger Mask comes around the 12-minute mark in the match. He's been on the receiving end of a brutal beatdown by the two older wrestlers for several minutes straight, and just snaps. He signals to Kawada to untie the mask. In a moment of pure cathartic release 6 years in the making, the man who just seconds ago was known as Tiger Mask flings off his former identity to the audible shock of the crowd. Almost immediately, chants of "Misawa, Misawa" erupt. Kawada and the newly revealed Mitsuharu Misawa ride the momentum to victory. And momentum really is the right word here, because just a few weeks later, Misawa would come face to face with the man who stood atop the mountain in All Japan for the last decade, Jumbo Tsuruta. It happens at the Nippon Budokan, a historic 15,000-seat arena that served as All Japan's home base and the future site of so many of Misawa's greatest moments. Leading up to the match, a series of red-hot tag matches between Tsuruta's crew of established wrestlers and Misawa's group of young revolutionaries escalated the rivalry. Looking back at these important early tag matches, the battle lines between the Showa-era team and the Heisei-era team are clear even at a glance. Misawa's crew wears bright, loud colors representing Baba's vision for a new era of All Japan. Tsuruta's boys are clad in black, usually with classic wrestling trunks and boots, almost as if rendered in black and white. So by the time Misawa and Tsuruta got to the Budokan, audiences were foaming at the mouth. And it's not a fast-paced match, at least not at first. It's full of tension and intensity. Misawa is far from the rookie prospect he once was at this point, and the only thing green about him are his tights. And as for Jumbo, well, the old king isn't ready to give up his throne just yet. As the match builds and the two men pulverize each other for near fall after near fall, the crowd starts to boil over. The chants of "Misawa, Misawa" mount, and people leap out of their seats. As Misawa weathers the same offense that kept Jumbo on top for the last decade and kicks out on two again and again. The finish almost comes out of nowhere. It's a clean win, but not perhaps a completely decisive one. The message is clear. These two men aren't done with each other yet. And it is a genuine shock when Misawa gets the pin. The moment of victory here is almost euphoric. The crowd is on their feet. Tears are running down some of their faces. They're chanting Misawa's name so loudly, it's almost drowning out his music. Misawa himself is lifted in triumph on the shoulders of Kawada and Kobashi, his soon-to-be Super Generation army. Truly, a new era had dawned. And the story behind the shock finish is an interesting one in and of itself. Because a young talent going over an established wrestler so early in their run together like this, well, it just wasn't done in All Japan. Legend has it the decision for Misawa to win that night was a last-minute call by Giant Baba. The day of the show, hearing chanting outside the venue, watching Misawa's merchandise fly off the shelves, and just generally reading the crowd as desperately behind the young star, Baba made the decision to have him win the match. He was also in close consultation with editors from the magazine Weekly Pro Wrestling at the time, and they urged him to break with tradition and put Misawa on top. The choice to do so apparently shocked Jumbo Tsuruta, who asked if it could at least be a DQ loss, to which Baba supposedly replied, no. That unforgettable Misawa win in the Budokan would start a historic sellout streak of 200 consecutive events in Tokyo, and 33 straight cards at the Budokan itself, 28 of which Misawa headlined. In September, the two would meet again, and this time Jumbo would get the victory. It was a singles match to determine the #1 contender for the now vacant Triple Crown Championship, and despite Misawa's meteoric rise to stardom, it was not yet his time to hold All Japan Pro Wrestling's richest prize. The Triple Crown would become All Japan's undisputed top title, and closely associated with Misawa himself in the 1990s. He and the likes of Stan Hansen, Kenta Kobashi, and others would be responsible for making it as prestigious a title as it was. But at the time, it was essentially brand new, and Tsuruta was the inaugural champion in 1989. In storyline terms, Jumbo Tsuruta was still very much the senior to Misawa. He trained him, he mentored him, and it would take more than one flash victory to supplant Jumbo. But Triple Crown or not, the power struggle between these two men was kept white hot, with thrilling tag matches both leading up to and after their second singles meeting. With Misawa, Kobashi, Kawada, and Tsuyushi Kikuchi on one side as the Super Generation Army, and the likes of Jumbo Tsuruta, junior heavyweight veteran Masanobu Fuchi, and Akira Taue on the other side as Tsuruta-gun. Taue was a young gun himself, but had to change sides after both Yoshiaki Yatsu and the Great Kabuki left the company to join Tenryu in his SWS. And make no mistake, these tag matches were absolute wars in and of themselves. The action is hard and fast, crowds are deafening, and many of these are certified 5-star classics. These are the fires in which the Emerald Emperor and his pillars were forged. 1991 would start with Misawa debuting one of his famous super finishers in a match with Akira Taue, the Tiger Driver 91, a vicious double underhook powerbomb that spikes the opponent directly on their head. It's a move he would return to over the years only when in dire need, and it gained a little bit of recent notoriety when Will Ospreay performed it on Kenny Omega in 2023. Misawa would develop an arsenal of devastating finishers like this over the years, as All Japan's Royal Road style escalated to ever more devastating heights. In April, Misawa would again lose to Tsuruta, this time in a match for the Triple Crown. But that summer, he and his old schoolmate Kawada would become World Tag Team Champions after defeating the monster duo of Terry Gordy and Steve Williams, and their first defense of those belts would be against Tsuruta and Taue. And it's in this match that something incredible happens. After 25 minutes of passion and fire, of elbow strikes and jumping knees, Misawa applies a front face lock and submits Tsuruta. It's hard to overstate just how shocking this was. Submission finishes in All Japan were exceedingly rare. It's another example of how crucial a role Jumbo Tsuruta played in the rise of Misawa, selling his trademark elbow strike like it was death incarnate, and tapping to his submission move was very giving for a man on top of the company. And it's hard to imagine Misawa getting the incredible start he did without Jumbo. But this would actually end up being one of the last major chapters in the unfinished book that was Misawa versus Tsuruta. In early 1992, they took each other to a thrilling time limit draw in the Champions Carnival, but this would be their last ever singles match. By October of that year, Jumbo had to step away from wrestling temporarily after being diagnosed with hepatitis C. And as far as Misawa goes, well, his ascension to the throne would be delayed no longer. On August 22, 1992, Mitsuharu Misawa stepped into the ring in front of a sellout Budokan crowd to stand opposite his last great obstacle to the Triple Crown, Stan Hansen. Hansen was a tobacco-chewing, bull rope-swinging force of nature from Texas. He'd been wrestling in All Japan for a decade and was the undisputed top gaijin, or foreigner, at the company. You didn't really beat Stan Hansen. You just sort of survived him. And Misawa had tried and failed to do just that earlier in the year. But this time, things would be different. The match is a tensely paced war where each man tries to break down the other with punishing, grinding holds. Long, drawn-out struggles for dominance are interrupted by explosions of strikes that make the audience wince. And it would be one of these strikes, a simple yet utterly devastating elbow to the jaw, that would finally put and keep Stan Hansen down for a 3 count. Thus would begin a historic 705-day reign with All Japan's top title, still the longest in the company's history. The era of the up-and-coming Misawa was over. The era of the Emerald Emperor had begun. We could fill a dozen YouTube videos with the heights Misawa would reach in the mid-90s. There were epic rivalries, 5-star matches, and sellout crowds chanting his name. But behind this larger-than-life heroic figure, there was a real person. A man with a family, some surprisingly nerdy hobbies, and a raunchy sense of humor. He once jokingly told a magazine that while recovering from an injury as Tiger Mask, he'd been spending the downtime reading a lot of pornography. He wrote that if you see a famous person at a communal bath, it's only natural to look at their junk. And he once said on TV, quote, "Every man wants to be thick and long." I'll let you figure out what he meant by that for yourself. Misawa also had a passion for sci-fi media and collecting, though he swore up and down he wasn't some kind of, nerd. In his online wrestler diary, he talks about buying a giant Kamen Rider figure, using an Ultraman alarm clock, being a fan of the Super Sentai series, and having a massive model kit from the anime space battleship Yamato. Misawa's room at his family home was apparently filled with toys and figures, and according to Pro Wrestling Noah researcher and translator Hisami, he also collected little Japanese capsule toys called gachapon. And he loved video games. Being on the road so much, his Game Boy Advance or Nintendo DS were constant companions of Misawa's. This would be on long bus rides, he'd play in the bath, he even talks about sitting on the toilet until his legs went numb playing his Game Boy. Some of his favorite video games included the Fire Emblem and Final Fantasy series, Dragon Quest, and Pokemon Mystery Dungeon. Speaking of which, there's a story out there that his favorite Pokemon was Bulbasaur, which, looking at Bulbasaur, makes a lot of sense. He was also a man who, at least later in his life, liked a good drink. There are stories of him staying out at karaoke bars till 7 in the morning, and a favorite restaurant in Sapporo that kept a special bottle of sake just for him, prepared by the manager personally. Misawa didn't actually drink much alcohol as a young man, but sort of got pressured into it by his wrestling seniors like Genichiro Tenryu. He, in turn, though, never pressured his own junior wrestlers this way. A hallmark, perhaps, of his more evolved approach to running a pro wrestling company. And here's a fun one. According to Hisami, he and FMW star Hayabusa were drinking buddies. You can only imagine those two at a bar together. But in the ring, Misawa was the ultimate stoic warrior, a man whose emotions were reserved only for screams of fighting spirit or rage at his opponents. And by the mid-1990s, that stoic warrior was dominant in every facet of the company's main event scene. By this time, the Tsuruda-gun Super Generation Army rivalry had long since ended, and a new group, the so-called Four Pillars of Heaven, represented the upper echelon of the company's main event scene. Not a faction, not a team, this moniker was given to the four men who stood head and shoulders above their peers in all Japan: Mitsuharu Misawa, Kenta Kobashi, Toshiaki Kawada, and Akira Taue. And Misawa was, without question, number one of four. His matches against former friend turned bitter rival Toshiaki Kawada redefined the standard for great physical pro wrestling and long-term storytelling. with each subsequent meeting between the two escalating to new levels of brutality. His tags with Kobashi against the so-called Holy Demon Army of Toei and Kawada still stand today as quite possibly the consistently best series of tag matches ever put on in a wrestling ring. And his singles encounters against Kobashi are some of the finest pro wrestling matches to ever grace the squared circle, equal parts pure violence and technique. So many of the big, important matches of this time period would go down as not just among the best in all Japan's history, but the best in pro wrestling history. And Mitsuharu Misawa was more often than not at the center of it. And through it all, he was innovating, creating new moves and techniques and putting his own spin on others. Many would become famous and emulated by wrestlers who came after. The super finishers like the Tiger Driver 91, Emerald Flosion, and the Elbow Strike. A move that couldn't be more simple also became one of Misawa's most dangerous pieces of offense. Established as a match-ending weapon in the early 90s, it remained this way for his entire career. Misawa won his first ever Triple Crown with it in 1992. He defeated Kenta Kobashi with it in 97 and beat Vader with it in 99. It is perhaps the ultimate example of how to protect a move in pro wrestling. And Misawa was also becoming critical to AJPW's success behind the scenes. As Giant Baba began to age, Misawa was taking more and more of a decision-making role backstage. Baba had no children, and Misawa was said to be like a son to him. Heading into the later part of the decade, he would grow into Baba's successor behind the curtain. And according to Hisami, this is when the resentment and conflict between Misawa and Baba's wife Motoko really began. You see, Motoko Baba was a key part of All Japan's business operations just as much as Shohei Baba was. While he booked the matches and dealt with the wrestling side, she handled, for example, the production and sale of merchandise. She also ran several subsidiary companies under the AJPW banner, and she truly deserves credit for the company's success as well. But in what the Wrestling Observer newsletter described as a good cop, bad cop dynamic, Motoko was always the one delivering the bad news to wrestlers in order to keep Giant Baba's reputation with the talent clean. This meant that while she was working hard to make the business of AJPW run, she became a figure to be feared and disliked by some of the wrestlers. A situation that would have drastic consequences for All Japan's very existence in the future. But we'll get to that. As the 90s wore on, something very dangerous was starting to take a hold of Mitsuharu Misawa: the fear of rest. His mounting list of ongoing injuries was beginning to break him down physically. While he had cut back on the amount of high-flying moves he did since the Tiger Mask days, the hard-hitting, spine-compressing style he wrestled as a heavyweight was absolutely punishing on the human body. And taking time off to heal just did not seem like a viable option for the man leading the company. You see, Misawa was trained in an era where you just did not take a day off. You didn't go to the hospital, and you didn't publicly admit you were hurt. Wrestlers performed with bad backs, broken bones, and necks that were held together with ice packs and painkillers. But more than that, it was becoming increasingly clear that when Misawa left, the business went with him. Let me explain. In the summer of 1992, Misawa had to miss a few tour dates because of a dislocated shoulder. Apparently, one of the local venue promoters on that tour threatened to reduce All Japan's payout if Misawa himself didn't show up to the event. Here's another example. On May 1st, 1998, Misawa, wrestling with a legitimate knee injury and back issues, loses the Triple Crown to Toshiaki Kawada in the main event of AJPW's 25th anniversary show. The loss would allow Misawa to take some desperately needed time away from the ring and rest and recover. The next two tours were major disappointments for the company financially. So Misawa ends up coming back earlier than he should have in August with still ailing knees to stop the bleeding. Every time Misawa tried to step away and get healthy, the bottom line seemed to suffer. And at this time, All Japan really was a live event business. By the early 90s, their weekly 1-hour TV program was moved to a 12:30 a.m. Sunday slot. By 1994, that was cut in half. 30 minutes a week on a late-night time slot. That's all AJPW had to get the word out about their product on TV. With live shows being the lifeblood of the company, you can begin to understand the immense pressure Misawa and others were under to never miss a tour date and never disappoint the fans, or the local promoters. This fear of taking time off, coupled with the intense physicality of the King's Road style, meant that by the late 90s, Misawa's body was showing signs of disintegration. It was among all of this that Giant Baba died on January 31st, 1999. When that happened, the Cold War between Misawa and Baba's now widow Motoko turned into an open conflict. At this point, Misawa was doing the majority of the booking for the company. Booking meaning planning and specifying wrestling match outcomes and angles. And Baba's will specified that Misawa be named president of All Japan in the event of his death. Despite this, Motoko was not in favor of the move. To take over the real-life presidency of the company, she wanted a man called Mitsuo Momoda, a journeyman wrestler and son of the legendary Rikidozan. Jumbo Tsuruta is said to be among the people who came forward and strongly supported Misawa taking the role. And so he did, on May 7th, 1999. The battle lines within the company's internal civil war were now clearly drawn. Motoko Baba on one, and Mitsuharu Misawa on the other. And there are various stories floating around about how that conflict manifested between the two of them during this time. Like how Misawa had reorganized and put a desk in Baba's old office where there wasn't one before, and this set Motoko off. Or how she scolded him for wearing a pink shirt instead of a white one. Or how the two disagreed on entrance ramps for wrestlers. Should there be a single ramp in a more modern style, or should they just stick with the classic two opposite arena doors? Misawa, for his part, was trying to change things, to modernize everything from the product itself to the wrestlers' employment contracts and health insurance. And Motoko, who wanted things to stay the way they always had been under her husband, was opposing him at every turn. She adopted a fiscally conservative mindset, not wanting to reinvest the company's profits into expanding the business, because apparently she believed that at the time, wrestling's popularity had peaked. And all the while, Misawa was still wrestling at the very top of the card. 5 days before being announced as the president, his fifth reign with the Triple Crown began after beating Vader in the main event of a Tokyo Dome show. The next month, he'd defend it against Kobashi in the Budokan in an absolutely punishing 45-minute match. The month after, he'd face Kawada in a different Budokan main event. He was president of the company by day and taking suplexes by night. You get the picture. As All Japan approached the new millennium, unable to outmaneuver Motoko Baba and run the company the way he wanted, Misawa began to quietly speak to his fellow wrestlers about leaving. He also approached the company's TV partner, Nippon TV, to gain their support. And then, on May 28, 2000, the storm that had been brewing for years finally came, when Misawa was voted out of the presidency by All Japan's board of directors. Just a few weeks later, on June 16th, he held a press conference announcing a bombshell. He was leaving All Japan Pro Wrestling, and taking nearly every single wrestler with him to form a new company. It would be called Noah. An arc, if you will, for anyone in All Japan who wanted out. There were a grand total of 2 wrestlers who did not walk away from All Japan for the arc. Junior heavyweight veteran Masanobu Fuchi and Misawa's former friend turned rival Toshiaki Kawada. Beyond the in-ring talent, 18 behind-the-scenes staff and front office employees also left with Misawa. And if there's one thing that's clear from reading contemporary interviews with the wrestlers who left All Japan, it's that they believed in Misawa. They believed in the changes he wanted to make and how he was working to improve the environment for talent. These people didn't jump ship just because they necessarily hated All Japan or Motoko Baba. They did it because they loved and believed in Misawa. All Japan itself would limp on, if only barely, with the help of Genichiro Tenryu, foreign imports, and a partnership with New Japan. But that is very much a story for a different video. While Misawa and those loyal to him would finish out some final July tour dates, once they did actually leave, Noah essentially replaced All Japan overnight. They had the same wrestlers, the same staff, they worked the same King's Road style, and they even took their old company's TV deal. In some ways at least, the Great Noah Exodus was something of a Great All Japan continuation. But while it did feel familiar, this was also something new. Misawa's chance to do pro wrestling for the 21st century. He would build a promotion with modern production values, an incredible junior heavyweight scene, which was something All Japan was never able to do, and appeal to women fans in a way New Japan just wasn't doing. On August 5th, 2000, the ARC launched, and Noah held their first show. Appropriately titled Departure, it took place at Differ Ariake Arena in Tokyo, a smaller venue that would be the home base for the promotion. This 5-match card in front of less than 2,000 people might not be noteworthy on paper if it wasn't for the watershed moment in Japanese professional wrestling that it represented, and people wanted to be a part of it. Scalpers outside the venue were selling ringside seats for as much as $2,700 and standing room for $800, according to the Wrestling Observer newsletter. Mitsuharu Misawa, leading both in front of the camera and behind the scenes, had nearly single-handedly turned the pro wrestling industry in Japan on its head. As for Misawa himself, he would continue where he left off in All Japan, running the company by day and main eventing by night. An absolutely incredible burden for one man to take on when you consider the pressure and work necessary to make this new business venture a success. Less than a year after launching Pro Wrestling Noah, the company debuted their top title, the GHC Heavyweight Championship, with Misawa himself becoming the first man to ever hold it. Now, the owner of a company booking himself to win the championship isn't anything new, but given the circumstances in this case, Misawa can perhaps be forgiven, especially seeing as it was a short reign that ended with Jun Akiyama, who was very much the heir apparent to the Four Pillars of Heaven, taking the title off him. So did Misawa's gamble pay off? Could the ace of All Japan succeed where the likes of Genichiro Tenryu and Riki Choshu had failed before him? Well, yeah. Noah's early months in operation may have been spent in intimate venues with more modest crowd capacities, but once they found their footing, the company took off running. By the mid-2000s, they were the top wrestling promotion in Japan. They had an incredible junior heavyweight division that produced the likes of Kenta, Naomichi Marufuji, and Yoshinobu Kanemaru. Kenta Kobashi's 2-year GHC Heavyweight Championship run is probably the greatest title run of all time in any wrestling company, and they ran the Tokyo Dome back-to-back years in 2004 and 2005, selling out both shows, or coming damn close to it. Events that would surpass New Japan in terms of ticket sales and attendance when it came to their own Tokyo Dome shows. The 2005 show, which is the company's biggest ever, was, by the way, headlined by a then 43-year-old Misawa, in a final battle against his old nemesis Toshiaki Kawada. With lasers, a massive stage setup, elevator entrances, and modern video production work, it was a classic All Japan match given a fresh coat of paint for the new millennium. But even at the height of Noah's greatness, there were some cracks in the foundation. On that 2005 show, the GHC Heavyweight Championship was buried in the middle of the card, a very uncommon thing for a major Japanese promotion to do. The current champion was Takeshi Rikyo, the man who won it off of Kobashi and one of the company's hopes for a future star. Unfortunately, that's not how things would work out. In fact, the failure to create new top stars in Noah was becoming a problem. Misawa himself was a huge draw, and Kobashi's epic run with the title was a high point for the company. Akiyama had his runs, Yoshinari Ogawa, and even Akira Taue had a short reign. But every one of these men was firmly rooted in All Japan and the halcyon days of the 1990s. When it came to younger talent who weren't tied to the previous decade, things weren't working out as well as Misawa might have hoped. Now, some criticism has been leveled at Misawa for this, with the idea that he waited too long to push new talent. But in all fairness, Takeshi Rikyo had been wrestling for just 5 years before he became GHC champion. And junior star Naomichi Marufuji held the company's top belt 8 years into his career. After all, it took Misawa himself 11 to wear the Triple Crown. Noah were also at a real disadvantage when it came to publicizing and popularizing new talent. That TV deal they inherited from All Japan was 30 minutes on a Sunday night at 1:45 a.m. Very few people outside of already hardcore wrestling fans were watching the program. The MMA boom of the late 90s and early 2000s had also negatively affected the wrestling business as a whole, and general public awareness of pro wrestling was down. So while Noah was riding high in the mid-2000s, that was in spite of broader industry trends. As Chris Charlton puts it in his book Eggshells, truly Noah's slice of the wrestling pie was getting larger and larger. The problem was that the dish itself continued to shrink. And then there was Misawa himself. He had been running the company and wrestling at the top of the card for years now, and the toll it was taking on him was obvious. As he entered his 40s, all his injuries, his lack of sleep, his drinking, his smoking, it all caught up with him in a hurry. Fans could see it on his face. He was tired, and his body was starting to become uncooperative. So did Misawa finally take time off to heal, leave the main event scene, and run the company from the front office? Unfortunately, no. In late 2006, with Kenta Kobashi battling cancer and no longer a factor in the ring, and attendance numbers sliding downhill, Misawa stepped up and put the top belt on himself once more. The fear of rest had struck again. On December 10th of that year, Misawa beat Naomichi Marufuji for the GHC Heavyweight Championship in a 25-minute barn burner at the Budokan. And despite his worsening physical status, it is an incredible match. The old king musters all he can and dials it up to 11, and the wildly talented Marufuji does the rest. Misawa takes more punishment in this match than anyone in his position should have to, with some truly shocking moves from the ring apron and entrance ramp. And this would be no token reign. He'd hold the title until early 2008, when Takeshi Morishima, another great hope for Noah's future, took it off him. Looking back now, it's amazing he never changed his wrestling style. Some of his peers, like Keiji Muto, went through multiple transformations and adapted to injuries and age as their years progressed. But Misawa was wrestling in 2008 like it was 1998, and by then, he was very long past his prime. Visibly in bad shape, there was no reason for him to be launching himself like a cannonball out of the ring, or taking tope suicidas from a 280-pound man. And knowing what we know now, that title match against Morishima can be a little hard to watch. Let's be clear about his physical state. At this point, Misawa's neck hurt just from brushing his teeth. He had impaired vision in his right eye. He'd suffered many concussions over the years and had bouts of lightheadedness. His weight had ballooned. He was on painkillers, drinking heavily, and chain smoking. And it's probably safe to say his cervical vertebrae was in dangerous condition after 27 years of pro wrestling. In fact, he'd already suffered a cervical sprain in 2007, an injury he did not take significant time off for. A year later, in March of 2009, Noah lost their TV deal with Nippon TV and moved to a smaller cable subsidiary. The global financial crisis was in full swing, and it was rocking the pro wrestling world too. A few months after that, on June 13th, 2009, Mitsuharu Misawa would step into a pro wrestling ring for the final time. It was a tag match in Hiroshima's Green Arena. Misawa and his partner Go Shiozaki were in the ring with journeyman wrestler Akitoshi Saito and a capable foreign talent by the name of Bison Smith. Shiozaki was the young man picked to be the future of the company, and he and the now 46-year-old Misawa had just won Noah's Global Tag League. This was to be a title match for the tag belts against Saito and Smith. 27 minutes in, Saito gave Misawa a backdrop suplex, a move Misawa had received many, many times over the course of his career. He didn't get back up. Lying on the mat, Misawa reportedly told the referee something to the effect of, "I can't move," or "There's something wrong, stop the match," and fell unconscious. The match was stopped, the house lights came on, and there was an announcement over the PA system asking the audience if a doctor was present. CPR was performed in the ring, and Misawa was turning blue. Wrestlers began to make their way to the ring as panic swept over the crowd. Some fans cried as they realized what was happening. Others screamed encouragement. Chants of "Misawa, Misawa" broke out as attempts to save his life were performed in the ring. And then it all went very quiet. Misawa was rushed to hospital and pronounced dead at 10:10 p.m. Although official sources record that he died at the hospital, it's believed that he actually passed away in the ring. According to some police reports, the cause of death was cervical spinal cord transection, a tear or break within the spinal cord. This injury may have also caused a heart attack. It's universally accepted that there was no problem with how the backdrop suplex was performed, and no blame lies with Akitoshi Saito. He had practiced it thousands of times, and of course, there is no neck drop move like this that comes without risk. In fact, after the incident, Dory Funk stressed there was nothing routine about the move, saying, quote, "It's a very dangerous move in wrestling. It's a move I don't train and discourage to my students," end quote. Misawa had been in dangerously bad shape for a long time at this point, and should not have been in the ring at all that night. The signs were there. Misawa's best friend from high school told the Nikon Sports newspaper that leading up to his death, he was showing some worrying physical disabilities. They would have lunch together periodically to catch up, and during these meetings, Misawa seemed to get worse and worse over time. He would rub his neck constantly. He couldn't stand up by himself at times because of the pain in his knees and needed to be helped getting up from a table. He had large dark circles under his eyes and complained about being exhausted for days after any amount of strenuous physical activity. When asked by this friend if he would retire and get help, Misawa told him, quote, "If I don't show up, customers won't come, and the company will go bankrupt," end quote. And like the straw that broke the camel's back, June 13th happened to be the night where it all went wrong. And it's something Misawa knew might happen. 2 years before his death, he penned a secret letter and gave it to a close friend. It was for the man who might accidentally end his life in the ring, whoever that might be. The letter read, quote, "You trusted me and applied your technique with all your strength, and I couldn't respond to it. It was a betrayal of trust. I am sorry. I want you to continue wrestling. It may be painful, but I want you to continue." It's a letter that Akitoshi Saito still carries with him to events to this day. In the immediate aftermath, Saito says he contemplated taking his own life. He had to live with the guilt of the accident, and once the details became public, there was harassment on himself and his family. Ultimately, though, he followed Misawa's final wish in the letter and continued on. He still wrestles for Noah today. And Misawa's death was a wake-up call for many. The day after he died, GHC heavyweight champion Jun Akiyama vacated the title. He revealed that he'd been working with a herniated disc in his vertebrae, and he would now take time off to heal. Noah also changed their policy when it comes to on-site medical staff at events. Now they hire a local doctor to be ringside wherever they go, and make sure defibrillators are easily accessible. Neither was the case the night Misawa died. Now, 15 years after his tragic death, Mitsuharu Misawa is remembered and revered by fans around the world as one of the greatest ever to lace up a pair of wrestling boots. If you love pro wrestling, you probably love Misawa. He could blow the roof off an arena and bring an audience to tears without uttering a single word. He was a man who defined the word aura, all without LED lights, AR graphics, or even an entrance ramp. He wasn't an entertainer. He was a wrestler who captured the hearts and minds of fans from Tokyo to Toronto. In the 90s, Misawa's All Japan matches were prized possessions for tape traders. In the 2000s, he lit up internet wrestling forums, and nowadays, clips of his work get spread across social media endlessly for a new generation to see. It's an overused cliche at this point, but Mitsuharu Misawa was truly an icon, and the company he started is still going strong. Noah holds memorial events the day he died most years, which feature a portrait of Misawa hanging from the venue balcony, an altar, and other ceremonial moments. Naomichi Marufuji once said, quote, "Until the end, he appeared to me like someone from the world of movies, or a hero from another world," end quote. And I think that's how many of us still think of him today, a larger-than-life figure who gave all he had to the thing he loved, but should never have had to. If you're still watching the video at this point, I want to say thank you. If stories like Misawa's captivate you as much as they captivate me, consider subscribing to the channel or even supporting it on Patreon. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank a few of the most important sources of information for this documentary. If you want to do your own deep dive into Misawa, you should stick around for this. You heard me mention Hisami a number of times in this video. They run a website called Noah's Archive, as well as several Twitter accounts that post translated articles and interviews from Japanese pro wrestling magazines and other sources. This material, along with Hisami's direct assistance in researching for this video, was essential for me to be able to tell this story. Speaking of translations, an English summary of a book about the 4 Pillars of Heaven was incredibly valuable in putting together details about Misawa's early life. That translation comes from Cameron Lee, aka Kinchstalker, from the Pro Wrestling Only forums. And of course, we have to thank uploaders like Roy Lucier, Classic Puro 83, and King's Arc, who make tapes more easily available to all of us.